Hello everyone, it is a frigid Friday morning here in Chicago. In the past 24 hours, I've been hard at work on a lot of my assignments and I've completed a good amount of them. It doesn't mean the stress is away, I still have quite a good amount of stuff to do, but I am certainly pretty satisfied with a lot of the progress that I've made. And once all is said and done, I will certainly have a lot of weight lifted off my shoulders. I only have to wait about 8 more days of hard work, and then by the time that Saturday comes next week from today, I will have finished the fall quarter here at the University of Chicago. But even through all of the work that I'm doing, it doesn't mean that I'm completely locked out from what's going on in non-academic world. I've been browsing through Twitter and Reddit, and earlier this week we saw a story that covered some of what revealed to be a healthcare fraud scheme that was propagated by a group of Somalians in Minnesota. And you read a little bit about them, and there is some merit to a lot of the stories. And I think that any responsible government, which is going to happen, any responsible government is going to get to the bottom of it, prosecute the people who are involved, and then make sure that we reform the system such that stuff like this doesn't happen again and people can continue to have trust in their governments. But of course, what happens whenever the perpetrators of any kind of scheme are disproportionately belong to some kind of group? You're going to have some kind of broader debate over the larger messages about that group. And you saw that conservatives and the right wingers on Twitter, they immediately jumped onto it as an opportunity to make broader statements about Somalian immigrants. Somalian immigrants not only do they tend to be very community based within their areas of Minnesota, but they also come from a country that has dealt with some level of dysfunction and some level of inaccessibility and political and economic troubles. And so in the minds of a lot of people, and perhaps maybe their grievances aren't as much based in particularly very identitarian based, but the Somalian groups is an easy punching bag. And what we saw with Donald, I just saw a clip from him on Twitter. He was talking about, these people, they contribute nothing to society. If I had the opportunity, I would just kick them out. And a lot of people are starting to share that broad sentiment. Now, one of my favorite Substackers, his name is Noah Smith, and he just posted a Substack post not too long ago where he says, they need you to make you hate some group. And as in the subtitle, as soon as you start judging people as a group, the rightists win. And I think that's an interesting post, and I think it'll make for some interesting conversation. So why don't we read about it? So I'll start. In the 2010s, a bunch of right-wing types suddenly became big fans of Martin Luther King Jr.'s views on race. If you saw someone on Twitter quote MLK's nostrum that people should not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character, it was almost certainly someone on the right. Quite a change from the type of person who probably would have cited King's words half a century earlier. This is from an Associated Press story back in 2013. King's quote has become a staple of conservative belief that judged by the color of their skin includes things such as unique appeals to certain voter groups, reserving government contracts for Hispanic-owned businesses, seeking more non-white corporate executives, or admitting black students to college with lower test scores. Many progressives railed against the idea of a colorblind society, arguing that statistical disparities between racial groups, income gaps, wealth gaps, incarceration gaps, and so on couldn't be remedied without writing race into official policy and becoming much more race conscious in our daily lives. In this policy space, this idea manifested as DEI, which implemented racially discriminatory hiring policies across a broad swath of American business, government, academia, and nonprofits. In the media space, this manifested as a torrent of op-eds collectively criticizing white people as a group. White men must be stopped. The very future of mankind depends on it. It's time for white people to understand their whiteness. What is wrong with America is us white people, and so on. Reputable institutions brought in speakers who made claims like whites are psychopaths and so on, making nasty jokes about white people carried few, if any, professional consequences. In that kind of environment, it's understandable that lots of people on the right would turn to individualist principles like the ones espoused by MLK in his famous speech. Asking to be judged by the content of your character is a reasonable defense against people who are trying to judge you based on your membership in a racial group. Fast forward a few years, however, and the shoe is on the other foot. The Wall Street Journal released an editorial urging us not to blame Afghan immigrants as a group for the Afghan man who shot 2 National Guardsmen in Washington, D.C. a week ago. It would be a shame if this single act of betrayal became the excuse for deporting all Afghan refugees in the U.S. Tens of thousands are building new lives here in peace and are contributing to their communities. They shouldn't be blamed for the violent act of one man. Stephen Miller, Trump's powerful Homeland Security advisor, responded with a dismissal of individualism, an indictment of Afghans as a group. This is the great lie of mass migration. You are not just importing individuals, you are importing societies. No magic transformation occurs when failed states cross borders. At scale, migrants and their descendants recreate the conditions and terrors of their broken homelands. This is a statement by Stephen Miller. And that same week, it was revealed that some Somalis in Minnesota had committed a massive welfare fraud. Federal prosecutors charged dozens of people with felonies, accusing them of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from a government program meant to keep children fed during the COVID-19 pandemic. At first, many in the state saw the case as a one-off abuse, but over the last 5 years, law enforcement officials say fraud took root in pockets of Minnesota's Somali diaspora as scores of individuals made small fortunes by setting up companies that billed state agencies for millions of dollars worth of social services that were never provided. Federal prosecutors say more than $1 billion in taxpayers' money has been stolen. In the wake of those revelations, Trump condemned Somalis as a group. Here are Trump's exact words. "I don't want them in our country. Their country's no good for a reason. Their country stinks. I could say that about a lot of other countries too. We don't want them. We have to rebuild our country. You know, our country's at a tipping point. We could go bad. We're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking garbage into our country. Ilhan Omar is garbage. Her friends are garbage. And from where they came from, they got nothing. When they come from hell and they complain and do nothing but bitch, we don't want them in our country. Let them go back to where they came from and fix it." Here you see the very same idea that Stephen Miller expressed. Trump and Miller both judge people by their ethnic group, and they judge those ethnic groups by the condition of their ancestral country. Somalia is a bad place, therefore Somalis are bad. Therefore, if you're a Somali, you're bad and you shouldn't be allowed into America. Afghanistan is a bad place, therefore Afghans are bad. Therefore, if you're an Afghan, you're bad and you shouldn't be allowed into America. In fact, this idea was very popular a century ago when America enacted harsh restrictions on immigration. Restrictionists argued that immigrants from South and East Europe were undesirable because South and East Europe were relatively underdeveloped places. And for example, here's what Francis Walker, the president of MIT and a staunch opponent of immigration, wrote in The Atlantic in 1896. "Only a short time ago, the immigrants from southern Italy, Hungary, Austria, and Russia together made up hardly more than 1% of our immigration. Today, the proportion has risen to something like 40%. The entrance into our political, social, and industrial life of such vast masses of peasantry degraded below our utmost conceptions is a matter which no intelligent patriot can look upon without the gravest apprehension and alarm. These people have no history behind them which is of a nature to give encouragement. They are beaten men from beaten races, representing the worst failures in the struggle for existence. They have none of the ideas and aptitudes which fit men to take up readily and easily the problem of self-care and self-government. Emphasis mine. This is a form of racial collectivism. It's judging people by ethnic, racial, and national groups instead of as individuals. In this landmark 1955 book, Strangers in the Land, in his landmark 1955 book, Strangers in the Land, which chronicles the anti-immigration movement of the late 19th and early 20th century, historian John Higham labeled this attitude racism. Today, of course, we can't use that word since it has been repurposed to mean so many other things. But the word feels like a perfect fit. It's an ideology, an ism, that holds that people are to be judged according to the collective accomplishments of their race. When I see people on the right spouting this sort of rhetoric, I think, what happened to MLK? What happened to judging people based on the content of their character? What happened to the colorblind society? What happened between 2018 and now that makes collective judgment of racial groups suddenly okay? The answer, of course, is the right has got the upper hand in American politics. It turns out that individualism is a bit like free speech, a principle that lots of people tend to support when their tribe is losing, only to abandon it as soon as they're back on top. A lot of people really do believe in individualism, of course, especially in America, but a lot of others just use it as a cynical shield when they're on the defensive. And we're finding out that most of the MAGA movement was always the latter type. MAGA's overriding goal is immigration restriction. They care about this much more than any other policy issue, more than inflation, more than trade, more than crime, more than anything. And the reason they want immigration restriction, I believe, is because they think that Somalis and Afghans and Haitians and so on are going to make America more like those countries. When Trump and Miller talk about this, I think they're being completely honest. And after Trump is gone, I think this idea will be at the core of the new right-wing ideology that will sustain the MAGA movement. Racial collectivism is absolutely at the core of their worldview. But MAGA has a big problem. While that worldview has some appeal to Americans, overall they aren't on board. Every poll we have shows pro-immigration sentiment on the rise again after a dip during the Biden years. And so they showed a graph, and right now it shows that the percentage of Americans who believe that the rate of immigration should be decreased, it peaked in 2024. It had a 10-year high in 2024 at around 55%, but now it's down to 30%. And also the percentage of Americans who think that immigration is a good thing is now up to 79%, whereas the percentage of Americans who think it's a bad thing has dropped to 17. So it's a 79-17 issue. A lot of Americans are also in favor of individualism. That is, of treating people based on their individual traits rather than what group they belong to. Americans of most races supported the recent Supreme Court decision banning racial preferences in university admissions. Even Black Americans were about evenly split. And while Americans disagree about lots of racial issues, they tend to overwhelmingly say they support things like equal opportunity regardless of race. And although there are differences in American attitudes towards immigrants from different regions of the world, the differences aren't huge, and they don't perfectly line up with how developed the regions are. For example, here's a 2015 poll by Pew finding that immigration from Africa is viewed more favorably than immigration from the much more developed regions of Latin America and the Middle East. And it shows that, yes, in fact, that Africa is viewed 26% positive, 50% neither positive nor negative, and 22% negative. And that's better than, yes, in fact, Latin America, which is 26% positive, 35% neutral, 37% negative, and Middle East, which is 20% positive, 39% neutral, and 39% negative. Here's a 2021 poll from Cato that finds the same pattern. So although some Americans are probably evaluating immigrants based on their racial group and are on the condition of their source country like Trump and Miller are, immigrants in general probably don't think this way. They get mad at illegal immigration and at the disorderly quasi-legal immigration that Biden tolerated. But illegal entry is an individual action, not a group trait. Which makes sense. The US immigration system is highly selective. Lazier, which 2017, shows that selectivity accounts for a very large fraction of the average educational attainment of different immigrant groups in America. As Matthew Iglesias points out, nowhere is this more evident than with Indian immigrants. The country of India is still poor, despite solid recent growth. Its GDP per capita is lower than that of El Salvador or Guatemala. Infrastructure has improved a lot, but is still subpar, and the country has pockets of startling poverty. By the racial collectivist logic of Miller and Trump, or of the restrictions of a century ago, Indian immigrants should be turning America into a third world country. And yet the exact opposite thing is happening. Indian Americans are arguably the most successful group in the United States. They have the highest median household income of any national ancestry group, and the highest average level of education. Even Indians who are poor when they arrive in America end up making well above the median, a level of mobility rivaled only by Chinese Americans. There are more billionaires in America from India than that of any other ethnic group. Nor has Indian immigration turned anywhere in America into a version of India. Fremont, California is probably the city over 100,000 with the greatest percentage of Indians, about 29%. And yet Fremont is one of the cleanest, nicest, richest, safest towns in the whole country, with a murder rate so low that many European countries would envy it, and arguably the best public schools in the country. A recent survey identified Fremont as the happiest city in America. Almost all of the MAGA people screaming about Indian immigration on the internet live in places less nice than Fremont. A big part of this, of course, is because immigration from India is so selective. India is the world's most populous country. It's not too hard to grab a few million smart people from a country that big, but this isn't the only reason. American institutions are also important. As another example, take El Paso. The overwhelming majority of people in El Paso are of Mexican descent. Mexican immigration is among the least selective because Mexico is so close to America and there is so much illegal immigration in the past. And yet, despite being filled with ethnic Mexicans, El Paso looks absolutely nothing like Juarez, the Mexican city that sits right next to it on the side of the border. El Paso's murder rate is 3.8, very low for an American city, while Juarez is one of the most violent, chaotic places on planet Earth. Mexicans didn't turn El Paso into Mexico, and the reason is American institutions. America's economy offers El Paso's residents the chance to get ahead without joining drug gangs. American culture is a more positive-sum, less violent culture than Mexico's. And the US military has a big presence in El Paso because Fort Bliss is there. Even without selectivity, institutions matter a lot. So Stephen Miller is just flat out wrong. Immigrants do not recreate the conditions of their homelands in America. Yes, there is some amount of carryover, including some negative influences like the old Sicilian mafia or modern gangs like MS-13. But the differences between American immigrant populations and their source countries far outweigh the similarities. In order for MAGA to win, they need to convince America otherwise. They need to persuade you, the American citizen, that the fiction that undergirds their ideology is actually true. To this end, they need to get you to judge people in terms of their group rather than as individuals. So they keep looking around for a group they think can convince you to fear, to disdain, and ultimately to hate. Remember last year during the campaign season when Trump and J.D. Vance declared that Haitian immigrants were eating people's pets in Springfield, Ohio. It was all BS, of course. Those crews descended to Springfield, but not even the most right-wing reporters could find a credible report of a single pet being eaten. J.D. Vance awkwardly begged the internet to keep the cat memes flowing and never apologized for smearing a whole group of people. But at some point, everyone realized it was a hoax. That's why you didn't hear anything about cat-eating Haitians before the campaign season of 2024. And that's why you haven't heard anything about it since then. It wasn't real. You were being played. And now they're trying again with the Somalis of Minnesota. This time, they probably have a better shot at success. For one thing, Somalis in America are much poorer than their Haitian American counterparts. Haitians in the US have slightly below average income and average education levels, they commit few crimes, and they're not prominent in politics. They're basically just quiet, middle-class people living pretty normal American lives. Somalis, on the other hand, are an extremely poor group with very high poverty rates and much lower income than Haitians or immigrants in general. This is due to the fact that most of them are refugees or descendants of refugees, which are the least selected type of immigrants. Somalis are Muslim, unlike Haitians, which makes them both visually distinct because of the hijab and mentally associated with civilizational conflict. They're not known for violence, but now they're associated with Minnesota's massive organized welfare fraud. And unlike the Haitians of Ohio, the Somalis of Minnesota are prominent and powerful in local politics. They managed to do a sort of takeover of the Minneapolis Democratic Party, nominating one of their own, Omar Fateh, as the Democratic candidate over incumbent Mayor Jacob Frey. Frey managed to beat Fateh in the general election, but only by appealing to a rival Somali clan and making flamboyant appeals to the Somali community. This is hardly unprecedented in American politics. Irish immigrants, built political machines that dominated the politics of many American cities in the 19th century. Given many decades, it's likely that Somalis will assimilate the same way the Irish did and turn the organizational skills that allowed them to swindle the state of Minnesota and take over the Minneapolis Democrats to some more constructive use, like building drone factories or whatever humans are doing 80 years from now. But many decades is a very long time for Americans to wait in order to not to worry about culture clash. And Americans aren't used to urban ethnic machine politics these days, and the notion of an iconic American city being at the mercy of clan rivalries from one of the world's poorest and most violent nations will naturally lend force to Trump's argument that Somalis are trying to make Minnesota into another Somalia. If Trump and MAGA succeed in getting a critical mass of regular Americans to reject Somalis categorically as a racial group, then they win a crucial victory. Not over the Somalis, who pose them no actual threat, but in terms of changing the terms of the discourse around race and immigration in America. Once MAGA can convince you that are the Somalis bad is a legitimate question to ask, then they pretty much automatically get to ask the same question about every other group in America. They get to ask, are Afghans bad? And are Haitians bad? They'll get to ask, are Jews bad? Are Indians bad? And are Chinese people bad? Eventually, they might even get around to asking, are Italians bad? And so on. They will push as far as they can, even if those questions get answered in the affirmative. Even if Italians and Indians and Haitians can all successfully defend their right to be in America by appealing to the court of MAGA opinion. The mere fact that they had to defend themselves as racial groups instead of as individuals will redefine what America is all about. It will move America toward being in a state society, a society where groups are accorded rights and privileges instead of individuals. In the 20th century, American liberals successfully overcame all of the people who wanted to make this country a racialist state society. Jim Crow was outlawed, immigration laws were made more or less race neutral, and so on. Liberals accomplished this by appealing to Americans' deep-seated value of individualism, of the idea that people shouldn't be judged by the group they were born into. That idea, captured most eloquently in MLK's famous speech, but repeated ad infinitum by leaders, writers, and activists, ultimately carried the day and made America the liberal nation I grew up in. What I fear is that by embracing identity politics in the 2010s, progressives have thrown away liberals' ultimate weapon. Appeals to individualism carry much less moral force when the people making these appeals just spent the last decade decrying colorblindness as a tool of systemic racism, or embracing people who made that claim. This is not to say that rightist push to turn America into a balkanized racial hierarchy is progressives' fault. It isn't. Rightists are always trying to do this sort of thing. It's not a reaction to anything progressives did. But there's a reason this sort of racial collectivism has defeated and suppressed for 100 years. And there's a reason it's breaking through now when it couldn't before. So that article from Noah Smith, I think it's really insightful, and it's something that I think about. I don't think too often about racial or social or cultural politics in the same way that I think about immigration. But of course, it's when I do think about it, and I think about the type of society I want to be in, a lot of it echoes the sentiments that Noah Smith and liberals of the past have echoed. The idea that one of the things that makes America so great is the belief in those MLK words, the belief in the individual, the belief that anybody has a right to be judged depending on their own actions and not be a victim and not have to be profiled based off of any kind of stereotypes about people who look like them. Traditionally, as in this story, we saw it in race, but it can also be things about sexuality or religion or anything else. You try to treat people as the individual that they are. And I think a lot of that I think that means a lot. And another thing that he mentioned about how individuality can sometimes be used very frequently when you're in the minority, but then all of a sudden, when you start to get the When you started getting an advantage in the cultural debate, or if you get a leg up, now all of a sudden you throw that individuality away and you start hammering down on people as groups. A lot of the MAGA movement transitioned from saying treat people as individuals during more progressive times, and then now that there's been, and this is debatable, but a little bit more of a conservative cultural environment, now they're slamming and started blaming groups on their own. I think it's important when we're creating a society that we have a society that has two major traits. One, that has a level of understanding that people are shaped, that people get influences in the way that they view the world and the way that they conduct their lives is in some respects determined by the community they grew up with, the culture they grew up with, and then of course stuff like the education of their parents and poverty. And then also recognizing that people have the autonomy to become who they are as individuals. And that especially if we can give them the opportunities, the tools to create some level of mobility, the ability to create their own story for themselves, then that really is the kind of ideals that this country is built on. This is a little bit personal for me too. Both of my parents are immigrants. My mom came from South Korea and my dad came from Benin, West Africa. And my dad is just an unbelievably fascinating guy. For whatever reason, he just always loved to read. He really loved to read and he loved to study. When I was in the house and I would just be doing my things, I would watch Netflix or I would be playing video games, he would be on his iPad, he would be on his computer, or sometimes he would be reading physical books, and he would just do a ton of reading. And not just, for enjoyment, he would be reading very technical medicine, very technical medical text. He's an anesthesiologist. And something that always would just wowed me is the fact that, despite coming from an area where he didn't really have a lot of built-in advantages, he went from West Africa, he made it all the way to France, and then from France he immigrated to America. And throughout this journey, he had multiple people in his life that really gave him some help when he really needed it. Some people who would help offer him some housing and gave him some hospitality. And then when and then in times when he was working, he just had people who helped him when he needed it. And so he somehow managed to get to where he is here in the United States, and he's been practicing medicine for 25 years, and he's just unbelievably brilliant. The idea that we would bar my dad from ever practicing medicine in the United States, or even if he didn't practice medicine, okay? Even if he was a carpenter or he was a cleaner or something, that we would bar them from doing it because we're just saying nobody should ever get in here because the country that you're from is poor, is just preposterous to me. And then, this isn't just some charity. This isn't just some appeal to our greater angels. We have proof of it. You look at India, okay? India is a relatively poor country is in per capita terms, and it especially was poor when a lot of Indians immigrated here however many years ago. And yet, as we talked about, the Indian Americans are unbelievably successful. When we start grading people by those groups, we deprive them of the autonomy to say that they can improve themselves mobility-wise, that they can go from being somebody who maybe doesn't have the privileges of other groups or people with more income than them. We're depriving them of the ability to say that if I try hard enough and maybe if I get a little bit lucky, I can really move up and make a better life for myself. And that's what America is all about. And so, when I just read this story and I think about some situations going on, I really do think that this focus on that coupling, the fact that we understand that people are shaped by the environment that they grew up with, and we should have some level of compassion and empathy and understanding and curiosity and understanding different cultures and ways of life and understanding where people come from. And also combine that with the reverence that we have, the positive aspirations that people can always determine who they are if they work hard enough and possibly be given the opportunities, given strong opportunities in the form of education and maybe a little bit of a leg up in the form of redistribution early on, that this allows anybody to create a success story for themselves. That is the heart of, in my view, of what makes America so great. So those are my thoughts. It's some things to think on. I'm glad that I was able to end this story that has a lot of emphasis on racial profiling and racial stereotyping, and ended on a more positive note, that it's actually those MLK words that you judge people not by the race, color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I think it paves a very positive vision for what this country can be if we try hard enough. So that's going to be it for me, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.